As I mentioned a moment ago, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin returned to Israel today, calling it a strategic imperative that Israeli forces protect civilians as part of their war against Hamas. Well, reports indicate that the Secretary's visit continues the Biden administration's push for Israeli leaders to scale back from the current phase of their war against Hamas. But just yesterday, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu vowed to fight to the end in Gaza. So is the Biden administration's latest message today at odds with the goal of the Prime Minister? Well, joining me now to discuss this and more is Carolyn Glick. She's a senior contributing editor at the Jewish News Syndicate and host of the Carolyn Glick Show on the Jewish News Syndicate. Carolyn, welcome back to Washington Watch. Great to have you.
Great to be on your program. Thanks for having me.
Well, listen, let's start with your reaction to Secretary Austin's visit and the remarks he made today.
His remarks were very similar to the remarks made by National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, who was here at the end of last week. We've really sort of had this constant flow of senior administration officials to Israel every several days, every week or so, really almost since October 7th. And so Secretary Austin came. He said he stated American support for Israel's goal of defeating Hamas, of eradicating Hamas in Gaza. But then, as you mentioned in your introduction, he was placing limitations and hectoring Israel to do it in a certain way. And this goes together with an American policy that is requiring Israel, as a condition for continued American support for the operation, that we allow hundreds and hundreds of trucks of supplies into Gaza, which they refer to as humanitarian resupply or humanitarian aid. But really what it does, because Hamas is in control of large swaths of Gaza, including the border with Egypt, this is aid that goes directly to Hamas first, and then to Hamas apparatchiks second, and then is largely sold in the black markets by hawkers who crank the price up by 500% or so for the civilians that the United States claims that it's geared towards helping. So what the United States is doing with this is guaranteeing the longevity of Hamas's war machine, or at least prolonging that lifetime by continuing to supply it with food and water and fuel. So that undermines Israel's operational freedom and our flexibility, and also prolongs the life of the enemy. So the United States says something and does something that's the exact opposite of what it says, and it couches it all under this need to maintain allegiance to international law, which Israel does, like the Americans do in their wars, as a matter of course. So the hectoring is also a form of slander, because by saying you have to abide by international law, you're insinuating that Israel is doing something other than that.
Well, that's right, and that's what the problem is we support Israel, but, and that's what creates a lot of problems in all of this on both sides, those of us here in the United States who support Israel, but also certainly Israel itself. So what we have here, it appears, Carolyn, is the Biden administration trying to thread a needle. And is this attempt to thread the needle really, is it too thin of a needle to try to thread? I mean, they're saying they support Israel, but they criticize the methods for conducting war against a terrorist opponent.
Well, it's the United States basically has, it has several leverage points over Israel. As its ally, Israel has trusted the United States. It ended a lot of its own production lines of shells and ammunition, trusting that in time of need, the United States would abide by its commitment to Israel and provide us with the ammunition that we need in order to fight. And that's being held up now, and the Senate just refused to pass again because they want a different bill. They want everything to be together: aid for Israel, aid for Ukraine. And the Republicans tried to separate them. And so the Democrats on the Senate side today blocked the aid bill to Israel from going through at least until the beginning of next year, after the Christmas holidays. So that's being held up. The Americans have the issue of the UN Security Council, where you have constant harping to force Israel into a ceasefire through a UN Security Council resolution. The Americans vetoed one last week, but this week there's another one that's going to be voted on, and you can assume that it'll always be on. So Israel is constantly on edge. Is the United States going to veto a Security Council resolution or abstain and enable it to go through? So that's another point of leverage that the United States holds over Israel. And so you see a lot of decision making by the government that is absolutely counter to what they said that Israel would and wouldn't do. And it's all in keeping with American demands on Israel. So the United States is using the leverage that it has over Israel because Israel views it as a trusted ally in order to, in many cases, particularly with everything having to do with supplying Gaza or supplying Hamas, first and foremost in Gaza, with water and food and fuel, the United States is undermining Israel's war effort.
Well, and Israel right now is resolute. Prime Minister Netanyahu is saying we will destroy Hamas, and frankly, they have to. I mean, they live in an extremely difficult neighborhood where everyone around them wants to annihilate Israel, and it seems as though the United States, in waffling just a little bit by saying, "Yeah, you can protect yourself," but I mean, the reality, these are terrorists. These are people who hate Israel. They hate the United States as well, for that matter. How many of them are crossed our own border? But the prime minister is absolutely right in his resolve. Wouldn't you agree?
Well, I mean, the Israeli people view destroying Hamas as an imperative for our survival. There's literally no argument here that this is a war for Israel's survival. Prime Minister Netanyahu has referred to it as Israel's second war of independence. We simply cannot continue to coexist with a genocidal terrorist organization that just committed an act, a day of Holocaust inside of sovereign Israeli territory, and is still holding over 130 Israeli hostages in Gaza. So, we cannot coexist with Hamas. But Hamas, of course, isn't alone. It's one of many Iranian proxies that's operating against Israel in the region. And that's another issue, which is that the United States is saying they want to do everything to avoid a regional war, except a regional war is being fought throughout the region by Iran's proxies, not only against Israel, but against U.S. forces in Iraq, in Syria, shipping in the Red Sea. And in Lebanon, we have Hezbollah, which is Iran's foreign legion in Lebanon, which controls that country, that poses an existential threat to Israel and is constantly escalating its attacks against Israel along the border. So this is a war that it's very, very difficult to fight. And that not only does Israel have to fight it, but it has to win it. And it has to win it in a way where nobody will have any question about who wins this war, just as nobody thinks, wait, did Germany win World War II or the Allies? Everybody knows it was the Allies, and it doesn't matter where they are in Timbuktu or where have you. I mean, everywhere in the world, everybody always knows that. Same too here. Everybody has to come away with this war recognizing that Israel
Absolutely.
won, because otherwise Israel's survival will be called into question.
Carolyn Glick, thank you so much for joining us on Washington Watch and keeping us up to speed on this. Our prayers are with Israel. Thank you for keeping us up to speed.